I'd like to move on to the next item on the agenda, which is a decision item on the Regulatory Document 2.13.2, Import and Export as outlined in CMD 16M25 and 16M25.A. And I understand that Ms. Owen Whitred will make the presentation. Over to you.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président, membres de la Commission. My name is Karen Owen Whitred, Director of the Regulatory Framework Division. With me today are Claire Pike, Senior Advisor, the Non-Proliferation and Export Control Division, Susan Funderich, Regulatory Framework Officer, Kathleen Heppel-Massis, Director General, Directorate of Security and Safeguards, and Brian Torrey, Director General, Regulatory Policy Directorate. Before proceeding, I would like to note one correction to CMD 16-M25. In the executive summary of this CMD, that's on page 1, within the 4th paragraph, the text reads, the CNSC received 47 comments from 6 respondents. This is a typo and should read 36 comments from 6 respondents. We are here today to request that REGDOC-2.13.2, Import and Export, be approved for publication and for use by CNSC staff in assessing the acceptability of licensees' import and export activities. Before turning the presentation to Ms. Pike, who will discuss the document in detail, I will briefly review where RegDoc 2.13.2 is situated within the CNSC's regulatory document framework. To enhance accessibility of our regulatory expectations, the CNSC structures our regulatory documents according to the framework shown here. This slide shows where RegDoc 2.13.2 fits into the CNSC's broader document framework. It is situated within Section 2.13, Safeguards and Non-Proliferation. This section also includes regulatory requirements and guidance for accounting and reporting of nuclear material. I would now like to turn the presentation over to Ms. Pike.
Good morning. My name is Claire Pike, and I am speaking to you today in my capacity as the technical lead for this document. During today's presentation, I will identify the goal of this RegDoc, provide you with some general context of the licensing program, and discuss the benefits of the RegDoc. I will also identify some of the topics addressed and the consultation process that was followed. The presentation will close with staff's conclusion and our recommendation to the Commission to approve the import and export RegDoc for publication. This document sets out the CNSC's guidance for current and prospective licensees who intend to import or export nuclear and nuclear-related dual-use items, also known as controlled nuclear substances, equipment, and information. During the presentation, these terms will be used interchangeably. The RegDoc represents a significant milestone, codifying the CNSC's existing practices and procedures in one document developed specifically for an external audience. In terms of context, each year the CNSC, through a designated officer, issues between 500 to 700 import and export licenses for nuclear and nuclear-related dual-use items. 80% of these licenses issued are export licenses. Our licensees range from larger companies that are well known within the CNSC and the nuclear industry writ large to smaller, less known companies with only a handful of employees. The next slide provides an overview of the import-export regulatory document. In terms of content, the REGDOC outlines the basis for import and export controls implemented by the CNSC for controlled nuclear substances, equipment, and information. It also explains the domestic and international aspects of the licensing program. The REGDOC provides practical information, such as how to apply for a CNSC import or export license, what is authorized by these licenses, and the processing time and service standards. The REGDOC also describes how the CNSC evaluates import and export license applications and how we verify compliance with regulatory requirements. Everything noted so far describes current practice, and as such, the REGDOC is essentially a guidance document. There is one exception, however, and that is the final paragraph in section 4.2 of the REGDOC on foreign origin uranium. This paragraph identifies a departure from current practice that is being proposed by the CNSC in order to strengthen nuclear non-proliferation controls. The next slide provides some background on the type of items controlled under this licensing program. So, just what are controlled nuclear substances, equipment, and information? They are those items listed in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation, Import, and Export Control Regulations, and represent the items of most concern from a nuclear proliferation point of view. The NNIECR are based on lists of nuclear and nuclear-related dual-use items agreed by the Nuclear Suppliers Group, a multilateral export control regime of which Canada is a member. The regulations are comprised of two parts, Part A and B. Items listed in Part A of the regulations are those controlled nuclear substances, equipment, and information that are especially designed or prepared for nuclear use. They represent about 70% of the licenses issued under these regulations. Examples of the types of items listed in Part A include uranium, plutonium, reactor equipment, and related technology. Items listed in Part B of the regulations are those that have legitimate non-nuclear applications but can also make a significant contribution to an unsafeguarded nuclear fuel cycle or nuclear explosive activity. They represent about 30% of licenses issued under these regulations. Examples of the types of items listed in Part B include high-purity nickel powder, certain types of machine tools, high explosives, and related technology. The next slide will outline the benefits of this regulatory document. This REGDOC is essential to communicating the regulatory program for import and export controls. Staff already do this through the CNSC website and by being accessible to existing and prospective licensees, for example, on the other end of the telephone, on-site meetings with companies, in order to address any questions that they might have. All of this is important. However, it's also necessary to have a reference document that exporters and importers can use as a go-to resource to better understand the context of the program, as well as the specific regulatory requirements that are placed on them. Finally, the REGDOC can be an important outreach tool where dual-use exporters are concerned. Their product lines are those that have legitimate commercial applications, but could also, in the wrong hands, make a significant contribution to an unsafeguarded nuclear fuel cycle. Given the nature of their business, they may not be aware that their products are controlled for export. This can have serious repercussions from a non-proliferation point of view. Nobody wants to have Canadian exporters, unwittingly or knowingly, supplying nuclear weapons programs. Now that some of the benefits of this RegDoc have been identified, we will look at the consultation process that was followed by staff. The RegDoc was sent to subscribers of the CNSC's info email account, as well as to current and past importers and exporters of items listed in the regulations. The 60-day consultation period began in February 2014, and the feedback on comments received occurred between May and June 2014. In total, staff received 7 submissions and dispositioned 37 comments. All of the comments submitted and the CNSC's responses to those comments are detailed in a 21-page consultation table that was included as part of the CMD package. I would like to note that a number of revisions were made to the RegDoc based on the comments received. The revised RegDoc and the disposition table, the first was from Bruce Power with 2 comments related to a typo and a copy-paste error. I'm sorry, I've missed a bullet, so I'm just going to go back. So I was finishing up with that we had made a number of revisions to the RegDoc based on the comments received. And what I should have said next was the revised RegDoc and the disposition table were emailed in April of this year to all who submitted comments. 2 additional submissions were received after that. The first was from Bruce Power with 2 comments related to a typo and a copy-paste error in the dispositioning table. Both of these were addressed. The second comment received was from Cameco and registered their continued concern with the change being proposed by the CNSC in Section 4.2 of the RegDoc with respect to exports of foreign origin uranium. This will be addressed in greater detail later in the presentation. The next part of the presentation examines the 3 key comments raised during the public consultation. For each key comment, staff will provide the relevant background and how the CNSC addressed the concern. The first key area of comment was with respect to intangible technology transfers and how to comply with Section 18 of the General Nuclear Safety and Control Regulations. Section 18 of the General Regs is an example of one tool that the CNSC uses to verify compliance for the export and import of items listed in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Import and Export Control Regulations. Section 18 requires a licensee on importing or exporting a nuclear substance, prescribed equipment, or prescribed information to present their import or export license to a customs officer. It's important to note that all controlled nuclear information is prescribed information for the purposes of the Act with respect to the import and export of that information. The NNIECR defined controlled nuclear information in sections A4 and B3 of those regulations. By way of background, it is technical data for the design, production, construction, operation, or maintenance of any item listed in the regulations, except when that information is publicly available. For example, the regulations control the export and import of fueling machines. Therefore, any technical data related to the design, production, construction, operation, or maintenance of a fueling machine would be considered controlled nuclear information. Now back to the Section 18 requirement saying that an exporter must present their authorization to a customs officer. In most cases, this is done by citing the license in the documentation provided to Canada Border Services Agency prior to import or export. However, this is not so straightforward when a licensee imports or exports prescribed information through intangible means. Examples of intangible transfers include exchanging information through emails, downloads, telephone conversations, or training. In these cases, it's difficult to present the CNSC license because the information does not physically cross the border. Moreover, Canada Border Services Agency does not require an export or import declaration in such circumstances. In response to licensee concerns, the CNSC has proposed that Section 18 of the General Regs be amended to remove the requirement to present an import or export license to a customs officer for prescribed information. In the interim, stakeholders have been advised to consult with the CNSC when submitting a license application that involves intangible transfers of technology to discuss how they can remain compliant with Section 18 until the proposed amendment takes effect. The second key area of comment was regarding a preference for a single export authorization process in Canada for nuclear and nuclear-related dual-use items. Presently, both the CNSC and Global Affairs Canada control the export of these items. The CNSC issues licenses through its nuclear non-proliferation regulations, and Global Affairs Canada issues permits through its export control list. While the preference of licensees for a single authority in this area is understandable, it's not feasible at this moment, given that there are two separate acts involved, the Nuclear Safety and Control Act and the Export and Import Permits Act. And each of these acts has their own statutory requirements. Additionally, making such a change is well beyond the scope of this REGDOC. Finally, it's important to note that in recognition of this overlap, Global Affairs Canada introduced general export permits for nuclear and nuclear-related dual-use items when certain criteria are met, and one of these is a CNSC export license. The final key area of comment was with respect to using Section 4.2 of the REGDOC to change how the CNSC implements Canada's nuclear non-proliferation policy, where exports of foreign origin uranium for nuclear use are concerned. During the 2014 consultation period, the REGDOC stated that all exports of foreign origin uranium for nuclear use would be made subject to a nuclear cooperation agreement between Canada and the recipient country at the time of export. A nuclear cooperation agreement is a treaty-level agreement that establishes reciprocal obligations between Canada and the partner country. These obligations are designed to minimize the risk of proliferation associated with the international transfer of major nuclear items. It's important to emphasize that the obligations are on the recipient country, not on the exporter. Cameco, the only stakeholder affected by this change, registered significant concerns with the proposed approach. Presently, Canada's nuclear non-proliferation policy requires that only exports of Canadian origin uranium are subject to a nuclear cooperation agreement between Canada and the recipient country. In response to the concerns raised, the CNSC held a meeting in January 2015 with interested stakeholders to discuss the proposed change in approach. During the meeting, Cameco stated that there should have been earlier engagement on this policy change, for example, a discussion paper on the issue. They also expressed the concern that the proposed change could result in commercial uncertainty. They stated that placing Canadian obligations on foreign origin uranium that has been processed in Canada could result in customers choosing conversion services from other countries. At this juncture, I'd like to use the diagram on the next slide to outline the CNSC's approach to exports of foreign origin uranium for nuclear use. So this slide will unfold in three phases. to explain what is presently being done, what was initially proposed in the draft Reg Doc that went out for public consultation in 2014, and finally, the revised language that is now being proposed as a result of the concerns expressed by Cameco. The first row that we see, which is presently up for you, represents what is happening currently. Before getting started, however, I'd like to start with a small roadmap for this slide. The cylinders on the slide represent uranium, and you will see that within each cylinder there is a name of a country. So, for example, on the left of the slide, we start with Canadian uranium, as well as uranium from Australia and Namibia. The uranium from Australia and Namibia are examples of foreign origin uranium, imported to Canada for processing, for example, conversion, prior to being exported to another country for further use in the civilian nuclear fuel cycle. The flags represent uranium that is subject to a nuclear cooperation agreement. This uranium is said to be obligated. In other words, it is subject to the non-proliferation provisions contained in the nuclear cooperation agreement. The arrows depict the processing of the uranium in Canada and its subsequent export from Canada. The right side of the diagram shows whether or not an obligation is placed on the uranium upon export. Cylinders with a flag are obligated. As I mentioned earlier, the first row, entitled Now, shows the current practice. On the left side, we see foreign uranium that has been imported for processing in Canada. The flag on the Australian uranium shows that Australia has made that uranium subject to its nuclear cooperation agreement with Canada. Therefore, it carries an Australian obligation as shown by the Australian flag. Still on the left side, we see that the other foreign origin uranium from Namibia does not have an obligation attached to it, and therefore there is no flag. It is unobligated. At some point after the uranium has been processed, the CNSC receives an export license application. So, what happens to each of these cylinders on the left side? Well, for the Canadian uranium, the CNSC exchanges bilateral notifications with the recipient country, and the uranium is made subject to a nuclear cooperation agreement between Canada and the receiving country. It's therefore Canadian obligated, and that's why we see a Canadian flag. Why do we do this? As mentioned earlier, Canada's nuclear non-proliferation policy requires that Canadian uranium is made subject to a bilateral treaty-level nuclear cooperation agreement between Canada and the recipient country. What is the current practice with the foreign origin uranium? When the CNSC receives an export license application to export foreign origin uranium, it does not exchange bilateral notifications with the recipient country. Canadian policy does not require foreign origin uranium to be made subject to a nuclear cooperation agreement between Canada and the receiving country. This is because in the late 70s, the ministers responsible for Canada's policy decided that foreign origin uranium processed in Canada could be exported for nuclear use to countries with whom Canada did not have a nuclear cooperation agreement, so long as these countries had signed and ratified the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and were members of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. This decision was taken at that time so as not to unduly restrict legitimate trade and fuel services provided by Canadian industry. As a result, foreign origin uranium processed in Canada is not made subject to an NCA between Canada and the recipient country. In the diagram, this is shown by the fact that there is no Canadian flag on the Australian or the Namibian uranium in the first row. Moving to the middle row, entitled Original Proposal, in 2014, the CNSC proposed, via the draft Reg Doc, to make all exports of foreign origin uranium subject to a nuclear cooperation agreement between Canada and the receiving country at the time of export. In order to strengthen nuclear non-proliferation controls. Implicit in this approach was the recognition that Canada now has more nuclear cooperation agreements than it did in the late 70s. Therefore, the original proposal, in the middle row, saw all of the foreign origin uranium picking up a Canadian obligation upon export. This is denoted on the right side by the Canadian flags on both the Australian and the Namibian uranium. In terms of the Australian uranium, it would have a double obligation, meaning it's subject to a nuclear cooperation agreement between Canada and the recipient country, as well as a nuclear cooperation agreement between Australia and the recipient country. As noted earlier, Cameco, the only stakeholder affected by the change proposed, raised concerns with this approach. And this brings us to the bottom row, revised proposal. In response to the concerns raised by Cameco, the text in section 4.2 of the REGDOC was modified so that foreign origin uranium that already has a foreign obligation will not be captured by the CNSC's proposed approach. Therefore, looking to the right side of the bottom row, we see that under the revised proposal, only the Namibian uranium, in our example, would be made subject to a nuclear cooperation agreement and therefore carry a Canadian obligation. To summarize, as a result of Cameco's concerns, the CNSC revised the original proposal so that only foreign origin uranium that is not already subject to a bilateral agreement with Canada, in other words, it is unobligated, will be made subject to the terms and conditions of a bilateral agreement between Canada and the recipient country at the time of export. This change would come into place with your approval to publish this REGDOC. As noted on slide 9 of this presentation, Cameco continues to have some concern with the change being proposed by the CNSC, even in this revised form. CNSC staff, however, note that the revised approach avoids a situation where Canada would be responsible for placing a double obligation on foreign origin uranium exported from Canada. More importantly, though, under the revised approach, nuclear non-proliferation controls continue to be strengthened since it ensures that all exports from Canada of foreign origin uranium for nuclear use are subject to legally binding treaty-level nuclear cooperation agreements, be it Canada's or another country's. If approved, REGDOC 2.13.2 import and export will be immediately published on the CNSC's website following the Commission's decision. There will be a 6-month transition period for placing Canadian obligations on exports of foreign origin uranium that was originally imported to Canada without a foreign obligation. This will allow the CNSC to outreach with our foreign partners with whom we implement these agreements. The CNSC will formally notify them of the change regarding exports of foreign origin uranium from Canada. Priority will be placed on those partners whose countries receive significant exports from Canada of foreign origin uranium for nuclear use. In conclusion, it is CNSC staff's opinion that REGDOC 2.13.2 import and export is essential to communicating the regulatory program for import and export controls related to controlled nuclear substances, equipment, and information to existing and prospective licensees. Quite simply, it assists exporters and importers in understanding regulatory requirements. As such, CNSC staff believe that this RegDoc is ready for final approval and publication. Thank you for your attention, and we remain available for any questions that you may have.
Thank you.